Hello. Should be coming through to the channel now. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in tonight for Assembly Online. If you haven't joined us before, Assembly Online is a free program of visual arts, sound, poetry and performance that comes to you every 2 weeks via YouTube. Tonight we'll be joined by Jonathan P. Watts, who'll be hosting Of and By. As a lot of you will know, it's been every couple of months since April last year. And joining him tonight will be the author, aka Blakemore, who recently published The Manningtree Witches. I'll let Jonathan do a full introduction, and I'll be back at the end for a little bit more chat at the end. For the upcoming programme and information on the summer show. Without further ado, here's Jonathan.
Thank you, Henry. Okay, so you should be able to hear me now. I would like to welcome you this evening, Thursday, 25th of March. My name's Jonathan. I'm an art writer and a sometime curator based in Norwich. I'm also the programmer of and By, which is an ongoing series of artist talks, screenings and conversations hosted by the Assembly House Trust in Norwich in the east of England. Of and By is part of the wider programme of contemporary art and activity that's overseen by the by the Trust's visual arts coordinator, Henry, you've just met. Before I give an introduction, I just want to note that the chat is open on the right-hand side, the stream chat for the YouTube. So if you have any questions, comments, observations as we're going along, please feel free to post in there. I will be checking them as we proceed. Hello to Sarah Lowndes saying hi to us from North Norfolk. This is something of an anniversary special. It's been a year. At the beginning of the first national lockdown in the UK in March 2020, the programme moved online, and what we've lost in the intimacy of physical congregation and conversation, we've gained in geographical reach. The programme Of and By doesn't have a thematic design. So in other words, it's not tightly programmed to develop a set of themes, but what does cohere the programme, however loosely, is that the work that's presented has some association with East Anglia, and that it points to overlooked or radical histories. Speaking of geographical reach, at the last event on February the 4th, we were joined all the way from high on a hill in San Francisco, 5,000 miles sort of that way, by the writer Robert Gluck. And Gluck is the author of the beguiling book Marjorie Kemp, first published by Serpent's Tail in '94 and reissued in 2020 as part of the New York Review of Books Classic series. Memorably, when I first wrote to Bob with this invitation, the first line of his response read, "For 25 years, I fantasized about someone from East Anglia sending a greeting to me." In November last year, we welcomed Matt Annis, author of Join the Future, Bleep Techno and the Birth of British Bass Music, which was published by Velocity Press in 2019. And prior to this, we've welcomed the Cine Women Collective, the force behind Norwich Women's Film Weekend, 1979 to 89. We've welcomed Justin Barton, who presented the audio essay on Vanishing Land, which was produced in collaboration with the late Mark Fisher in 2006. And we've also welcomed Louis Henderson, the filmmaker, and Emily Richardson, filmmaker. And long time ago, IRL, in real life, the collage artist Simeon Barclay. Tonight, we are tremendously privileged to be joined by A.K. Blakemore, poet, translator, and author of The Manningtree Witches. Published earlier this month by Granta, her first novel, the book has flown up bestseller lists and received acclaim in the national newspapers along the political spectrum. Amy spent the last couple of weeks doing online events, and after this one, as she proclaimed in a recent tweet, no more events for the time being at least, lol. really, which is just to say thank you again, Amy, for joining us this evening. Writing in The Guardian, Parag O'Donnell notes of Amy's fictional account of the Essex witch trials that while the persecutors are given close scrutiny, the book belongs to the persecuted. And on these pages, in all their ordinary glory, those women are at last allowed to live. In The Telegraph, Claire Alfrey, who believes the story's known feminist resonances might be a problem for some readers, frames the witch trials as the fake news of the 17th century, the post-truth of the pre-modern era, the virtue signalling of the illiterate mob. And a few days ago, I read that the author, Emily Temple, managing editor at LitHub, said that the book is like Fleabag meets Hilary Mantel. What so interests me about this is about these responses it's a reminder to us, I think, of the endless afterlives of history, right? Its use as a means to seek justice, to denigrate and discredit, as a means for potentially establishing intergenerational alliances. And The Manningtree Witches is written from the position of the protagonist, Rebecca West, an actual person who keenly observes the arrival of Matthew Hopkins, a Suffolk Puritan quack, who moves into the Thorn Inn and begins his self-ordained investigations into local witchcraft and sorcery. We know about these things, we know about these people, these events, because Hopkins documented it in his handbook, The Discovery of Witches. And throughout Blakemore's novel, historic evidence, testimony to demonical acts functions to quicken the narrative. The English folk horror revival, which sort of happened, I guess, just over about a decade ago, brought Michael Reeves's depiction of Hopkins and his assistant Stern in his 1968 film Witchfinder General back into profile. Never boomed the voice of the trailer, the voiceover for the trailer of the film. Never has England looked so beautiful and yet so violent. And Reeves's film is a sort of B-movie, soft porn, East Anglian Western. And Annie Sharp of The English Heretic has written that Reeves was a sort of tortured pornographer. In 2013, the painter Sophie von Hellemann's installation at Colchester's First Sight, named after the idiom cold as a witch's tit, depicted portraits of women murdered by Hopkins and Stern during the Essex witch trials. Some of you may have seen this wonderful show. Variously presented on a towering pyre and wall-mounted against a painted forest mural. Von Hellemann's work enacted, I think, a very simple, meaningful politics of making visible. It diverted from the Hopkins myth. And I think, you know, as a friend of Blakemore's work, faces of von Hellemann's installation are given vivid new dimensions in the Manningtree Witches. What's so interesting is that, as Amy noted in a talk last week at Flock's Books, what's so interesting is that we remember the name of Boudica, who's synonymous with the Eastern region, but do we recall the names of the Manningtree Witches? Talking about the book at the same event, Amy reminded us that Hopkins is one of the greatest documented serial killers of English history. This event that took place can be located in a particular place and in the historic record. And like the life of Kemp, who I mentioned earlier, who tried to live beyond the bounds of patriarchal clerical authority, the story of the Manningtree Witches continues to resonate for us and travels beyond its time and location. The historian Keith Thomas closes his remarkable study of witchcraft in the UK titled Religion and the Decline of Magic by characterizing magic as, quote, the employment of ineffective techniques to allay anxiety when effective ones are not available. According to this definition, he writes, we must recognize that no society will ever be free from magic. In other words, no society will ever be free from anxiety. Conflict is ongoing. Where there is unease and powerlessness, there is magic, and magic is the tool of the dispossessed. And as Beldam, Rebecca's mother in the Manningtree Witches, says, witch is just their nasty word for anyone who makes things happen, who moves the story along. So this evening, I'd like to welcome A.K. Blakemore. A.K. Blakemore is the author of 2 full-length collections of poetry, Humbert Summer, published by Eyewear in 2015, and Fondue, published by Offord Road Books in 2018, which was awarded the 2019 Ledbury Forte Prize for Best Second Collection. She's also translated the work of Sichuanese poet Yu Yoyo in 2019, a volume called My Tenantless Body. Blakemore's poetry and prose writing has been widely published and anthologized, appearing in the London Review of Books, Poetry Review, and the White Review, among others. And before I welcome Amy, I just want to remind you that the Manningtree Witches is available to purchase from your preferred independent bookshop right now. So I'd like to welcome Amy, and perhaps we could start with a reading.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for your kind words, and a massive honour to follow Robert Gluck in anything. Fingers crossed for the future. And thank you to everyone listening and watching. I'll just do a little reading. I was saying before we began that personally I don't like listening to people reading prose out loud, and that goes for myself as well. And this is a short, dialogue-free, spoiler-free part. Parliament secures a victory over the King in Berkshire against long odds, prompting a confused atmosphere of Dog Days Carnival across the villages and hamlets of Essex, the men drinking and firing their muskets off into the lilac dusk, for God's judgment is surely passed upon the unrighteous. They massage the spare accounts of the battle to increasingly extravagant divinity, and soon the Archangel Michael is manifesting over the field of engagement, and white horses gallop through their fuddled-sided dreams. September becomes October, becomes November. The harvest is brought in as the languid summer finally exhausts itself, and a painted effigy of the Pope is set to blaze on the village green. Matthew Hopkins reopens the Thorn Inn with little ceremony. As the year turns, his taste for dismal costuming provokes less astonishment, and even begins to make a sort of sense. While others rush about their outdoor business as quickly as they might through the autumn drizzle in an effort to repair to the comfort of their hearths, Matthew Hopkins struts about the town like a dour long-legged crow, with John Eads and John Stern and the most learned company he is able to find in so backward a place as Manningtree, happy as a Puritan might be. Some call him a backward man, a coltit. Others admire him. No family to speak of, but plenty of money, it seems. Matthew Hopkins rides his horse through a field at dawn and notices a black feather lying in the grass, glossy and ideal. Matthew Hopkins hosts. Matthew Hopkins expounds. Matthew Hopkins discourses, the town's foremost autodidacts groping for each morsel of his exultant theology. For he is, of course, a prince of air, says Hopkins, lifting the edge of his riding cloak in such a way that his learned companions might better appreciate the broidery of the hem, the sleekness of the sable. And it makes sense to them then, when he puts it like that, how the devil might thicken like butter and slide under the pantry door to cover a man all over, a man or a woman. They can imagine the devil there, some great thing in the sky, or as a mist rolling in off the river, gathering the smoke of scullery fires to himself for later use. Or as the miasma that hovers over the marshes and flats, bringing the ague, a dark head crowned in slender red leaves of narrow dock, a moth with mouths both front and back, cavorting in the autumn clouds that are like strips of flayed skin. The devil minces and the devil dances. He dances like a girl might, slender-hipped, hair falling wild around her shoulders, inflamed. Now the nights grow longer, he might go from door to door of an evening in the guise of a swarthy peddler, opening his coat to the wide-eyed good wives and maids, and where there ought to be bobbins of silk ribbon and little pearl buttons, he shows to them his merchandise of sootkin and smooth newt. This one here's prick ear, and this one pretty man. And all the while a grey cat watches from the strawberry patch.
Fantastic. The trial of these women is an historic account that we know how it played out, and I'm really interested in how you tell a story that's already been told.
So it's an interesting one. So I think it was something I read elsewhere about the book, and someone saying that not too fond of witch trial novels because you already know how it's going to end.
Right.
And my first thought was, and that's why people hate the film Titanic. Like, so I guess the repetitious nature of folktale is something I've always been interested in anyway. The idea that in some ways where the richness comes is in telling and retelling stories. On a kind of basic practical level, I did have that thought when I started considering seriously committing to writing this book of has this story, is it necessary? Is it something that is worth spending my time on? And I kept coming back to the fact that, yes, there are lots of witch trial novels. A lot of them function in a similar way, but none of them were the novel that I wanted to read about witch trials, like the old Toni Morrison chestnut, I guess. None of them seem to have a kind of perhaps there are, I should say this with proviso, there may be some I don't know about that do. I'd love to discover them. But to really center the accused in the way I wanted to, and to also to have an appreciation and to kind of uphold the texture of the ordinariness of life in some ways. Like I didn't want to write characters who were necessarily exceptional or lives that were other than incredibly ordinary in some ways. So I guess that's how you tell a story.
Which can you give us a sense of some of the other stories that you looked at in sort of research and getting a sense of how you wanted to approach this? Because you do acknowledge text in the back of the book, which is really interesting to me, that you provide a kind of bibliography, a sort of signpost of texts.
Yeah, so I think quite sort of pivotal in terms of the mood or the aesthetics of the Manningtree Witches, as it turned out, was The Witches by Stacy Schiff, which is a history of Salem. But obviously there are massive continuities even in terms of the people who were involved between Salem and the Manningtree hunt. They were the descendants of Manning, Manningtree residents of Southern Puritans in Salem. But one thing that Stacy Schiff, it's a history book, but it's desperately evocative on the way that the environment and again kind of the texture of life shaped the nature of accusation against witches, and shaped the kind of horror that was generated around accusations. Obviously, rural Essex in the mid-17th century and Salem about 40 years later were very different places. But she it's a really beautifully written book, and some of her descriptions stayed with me of how it must have been to be able to be walking down a path on your way back from an inn and hear a dog bark literally 3 villages over. It was that quiet, it was that dark.
Mm, mm,
Um, to live free to a bed in houses with desperately thin walls, where you
mm,
would be able to hear everything that was said, whispered, gossiped about.
mm.
Um, and that was something that really interested me, um, in terms of, as I say, one of my priorities being wanting to evoke the texture of life.
Yeah, because I
Yeah.
suppose that's sort of about situating yourself in that period and sort of understanding situating yourself and understanding what life might have been like and how drastically different it is on every level to ours today. This is something that I've heard Hilary Mantel talk about. What would it sound like 500 years ago? What
Yeah.
would my sense of scale be? I mean, there's this wonderful bit. Well, I keep saying wonderful. It's atrocious. But when Rebecca is taken to Colchester and sees this castle, Rebecca says, this is the biggest building that I've ever seen, and and it's sort of fascinating to place this in that way. I saw that somebody had suggested that you may have changed the outcome in the narrative. And you'd sort of admonished them and said that you couldn't go back in time and give them a ray gun. And I wonder, did you want to change the history, or were you tempted to rewrite the events?
So I probably, for my sins, I probably give Rebecca a happier ending than. We don't know how Rebecca West died.
Right.
There isn't a record of her execution. We do have her confession, so the historical presumption has always been that she gave a confession that implicated the other accused witches and was probably granted a reprieve as a result of that.
Right.
But we don't know what happened to her after that. I mean, maybe she married and had lots of kids and stayed in Manningtree forever, but I find that unlikely.
Mm.
Maybe she did go to the Americas. Maybe she died of a pox 6 weeks later. We don't know.
Mm.
So I think I kind of I was attached to her by that point, and I wanted to give her, to a certain extent, a redemptive ending.
Mm.
So I probably settled on what felt like the nicest of those many options of what could happen to Rebecca after all of that.
Yes, yeah. I mean, we could talk about the redemptive ending. I don't know if people may have had the chance to read it by now.
No,
Someone in the chat is saying that they've had a chance to read it, so they've just finished it today.
Oh, thanks.
But the redemptive ending is interesting because it sort of it sort of ties her into the new world and to a wider colonial enterprise.
I guess bittersweet in that sense, because there's also I think by the end of the book there's kind of a sense of kind of the collapse of the Puritan sort of edifice of ideas as well by the close of the Civil War, that Puritans are already emigrating because they know sort of the grand high parliamentarian tomorrow, blue skies, don't live up to their expectations. I didn't want to go quite as literal as having her ending up in Salem by the end of the book, but I think most readers who have sort of any notion of that idea of history knows what comes next. To kind of go back a bit to the idea of wanting to change history, I was quite interested in. So it's I try not to read Goodreads reviews or anything too much because it will drive you mad. But one thing I did notice in a couple of reviews was the idea of oh well, yeah, the characters don't do enough to save themselves. Like, it's a feminist novel, but ultimately they're a bit helpless. And one of the things, aside from kind of historical veracity, which obviously was important to me to a certain extent, or maybe not veracity, but authenticity, um, was also I have been quite frustrated at certain points with the idea that, most historical fiction that centers women, like, and I can see why it happens, and it's not a criticism by any means, but there's this idea that female protagonists in historical fiction are somehow exceptional, heroic. They do things differently to other women of their time. They blaze trails. And one of the things that interested me about Rebecca as a character was that, from what we know of her, she did no such thing. Quite likely, the only reason she survives is not because of incredible moral character. She doesn't tear her skirts apart and make a rope and climb out of Colchester Castle and then ride across the country firing a gun in the air. The reason she survives is because ultimately she bends to conform to a system that is larger than herself. And I was attracted to the idea of writing about a female protagonist who in some ways was not exceptional, and exploring that. And I think one of the reasons I dislike the idea of sort of feminist historical fiction as a label is because it often feels like it's applied to books about historically singular women. Whereas I think there hasn't really been so much of an attempt on the part of writers to evoke, to explore the life of ordinary women, the vast majority of women. And I kind of have always felt that was worthy of writing about as well. Yeah.
I mean, Rebecca lives with her mother, and she has this strange, complicated codependence. I mean, the mother certainly has a dependence, and is sort of bullying to some extent. And they have a kind of subsistence existence. And we have this extraordinary portrait in the book of the banal, everyday detail of women's work. And I mentioned to you earlier that there's this amazing detail where Rebecca notices, because class runs through the book in complicated ways, but there's a moment where Rebecca notices character Mary Parsley, who claims her labour, who claims her stitch work as her own, but it's actually Rebecca's. And I wonder if you could talk us through how you thought about the representation of women's labour in the book.
Yeah. So I kind of, again, we don't really know what Anne West or Rebecca West did. The Beldam West is just described as a widow, and Rebecca West as maid, daughter of the said Anne West. And that is all we get of their lives or occupations. So I was kind of working on best assumptions of maybe what would they have been likely to do. It's something Stacy Schiff is also really good on in her book, of the average woman living in a Puritan society beyond the basic subsistence labor that would take up most of your time, of fetching water, of raising livestock, of cooking, of caring for children. There was also thriving cottage industries. At the very kind of lowest end of society, one income wasn't really enough to get by on. So women, in the spare time they had, would be embroidering, would be darning, would be making candles to sell for profit at market. Just never-ending labor. When it wasn't to help yourself survive, it was to try and get in some way ahead of your neighbors. And so I settled on the idea of laundress and embroidery and sewing. So one of my favorite poets is Anne Boyer, and one of my favorite books by her is Garments Against Women, which is a really, really interesting kind of poetic study of the garment trade and clothing and its relationship with women, both in terms of as a form of self-expression, but also as an industry of production that has always been almost exclusively peopled by women. And there's a beautiful, I can't quite remember the exact word she uses, but a beautiful metaphor she uses about how for every suit of clothes you see, it sort of represents a ghost woman who poured hours of labor into producing those garments, and she is unseen and largely unthought of. It's something I'm particularly interested in the context of history, where so much of our conception of the past is bound up in the costuming, in sort of portraits of Elizabeth I and the ermine and the ruffs, and the beauty and the lavishness of it. But very little thought is given to who actually produced those things. I mean, the 17th century, lace was the massive thing. You know, the bigger your lace ruff, the better. And a lot of lace was obviously produced in also Puritan, certainly Protestant, the Low Countries. And women used to literally go blind as a lace maker was a phrase.
Right.
There's young, poor women. You had to make lace, you had to sit in basements that were wet, that were humid, that were damp. Otherwise, the threads would fray as you worked them. So they had to sit in these torrid, horrible basements in nearly absolute darkness, working by very small lights to produce these really elaborate lace collars that would end up bedecking the wealthiest people you could imagine, the wealthiest people that existed at that time. And they went blind. Like, some of them were blind by their early 20s. So it was something that was very interesting to me, I guess. Also the fact that embroidery weaving is, it's a deeply mathematical process. It involves a lot of, obviously manual dexterity, but also logic. And yet it's kind of denigrated and has always been denigrated as a woman's work. So that was something I was interested in. So yeah,
there is this, as I suggested, class runs right through this, and the intersection with gender, of course, as well. And at the opening of the book, there is this sort of sense of a highly ordered hierarchical landscape that's organized around power, and Rebecca sets the scene between Manningtree and Mistley, and we see these big houses at the top, and we see the slums by the river. And it's really interesting to me that merely 100 years later that the Store Valley would become synonymous with Constable, who had depicted the gentry wealth, depicted the ordered landscape. And I was really interested to hear to what extent it was important for you to counter those romantic visions of the area, and what might be at stake for you.
So my dad lives in Manningtree,
right?
And so I'm down there every Christmas, and I know Manningtree quite well. And I've been down to Flatford Mill, and
right.
where Constable painted the hay wain.
Yeah.
And all those kind of local little touristy bits. And Manningtree, obviously, it's a very beautiful place. It also, as I think I said in the Flocks talk I did, like many beautiful places in England, there is a feeling of cursedness about it. a feeling of kind of just a slightly unsettling energy somehow. And I don't know, maybe if the fact I feel that says more about me than it does about Manningtree. I mean, it's Tory as fuck, obviously.
Yeah.
Um, but
there's that. But it's interesting that that the English landscape, conceals atrocities. I mean, I was just thinking, I was reading Caliban and the Witch, the Silvia Federici book the other day, and I was reminded of Kett's rebellion in Norwich, and which was a rebellion against the enclosure of land. And sorry,
no, it's Manningtree. There's the witch trials. Manningtree is mentioned in a Shakespeare play. I can't remember which one, but one character calls another fat as a Manningtree hog, I believe. Right. And then before that, one of the earliest mentions of Manningtree is it's one of the villages or towns. I mean, I was probably still a village at that point, where the peasants rose up and joined the revolt. During the Peasants' Revolt, which obviously moved down across Essex with the men joining up as it went. And it's also, I think it's something that's uniquely interesting about the Civil War as a period of history. It's interesting because in these events, I think something a lot of people have said is, we didn't learn about the Civil War at all at school. I know hardly anything about the Civil War, despite the fact it was this brutal, formative period of history, not just for England, but for Europe and the world in terms of a formative revolution. And I think one of the reasons we kind of don't learn about it in school very much is because there is no way you can twist the Civil War into a national mythos of heroism. There is no way you can make the Civil War glamorous. Both sides, Cromwell ended up being an authoritarian weirdo and genocidal maniac, and Charles was petulant, weak. There aren't any heroes in the Civil War, basically, when it comes down to it. But I also think that one of the reasons we don't learn about it is because it was essentially a guerrilla war, is the way some historians describe it, in that it stretched to every corner of Great Britain, over into Ireland, up into Scotland, down to the very edges of Cornwall, and really, really nastily fought. And it kind of is the trauma that lurks around every corner, like particularly in the north. There's something people say about like place names, like, sounds like a Civil War battleground. And when you actually list the Civil War battlegrounds, when I was researching the book, I discovered that Colchester was besieged. I had no idea. Does anyone? There was a full siege of Colchester happening during the Civil War. And yet it's this kind of element of really traumatic, really dirty English history.
Well, also, I mean, Hopkins very easily manages to raise a militia. There's he is also the charismatic leader, and there is a sense of a sort of desire for such a figure, because he's a quack. I mean, this is sort of what you pointed to the other week. He wasn't state appointed, and actually there was some resistance to him. But the militia that he manages to raise in your book, it's violent. There seems to be no issues around casual violence. and he raises the militia easily.
It's so one of the things I found interesting about writing it was, so in some ways I found Hopkins the most interesting character to write, partly because it's kind of fun to project yourself into kind of hellfire dramatic 17th century Puritanism just from a pure language point of view, just adopting that kind of biblical register. But also because of all the characters in it, he's the only one people would have heard of before, I suppose. So there was kind of more potential to challenge preconceptions or whatever, I guess.
And he's an unremarkable man.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you do give a sense of, he's a sort of weak man. He's a fearful man.
I think, one of the things I ended up digging into was Calvinism, for instance. We know that Hopkins is described as a Puritan gentleman in historical records, but we don't know how he would have identified himself or what specific strand of Protestantism was his, or what he read or what he believed. But I think I did kind of come away from writing the book with not a sense of sympathy for him in any way, shape, or form, but a sense of the vulnerability of pretty much everyone at the time, including men with economic power and status, even to themselves. It would have been incredibly hard to be a Puritan woman, harder, obviously, but I think it also would have been very hard to be a Puritan or nominally Puritan man in the 17th century south of England. I mean, a doctrine like Calvinism, where you believe that people are either born saved or damned, and nothing you do in life will change that. It's almost inconceivable to us now that people believe that, but they did very much. And how that would have completely formed your thinking and your relation to the world, believing yourself to be damned or believing yourself to be saved. I kind of went for the idea of Hopkins as a Calvinist because I wanted to explore that. But how genuinely kind of bulletproof you must have felt if you were a Calvinist and you believed yourself to be among the saved. I guess one of the reasons I went for the idea of Hopkins as a Calvinist was because it felt convincing to me that someone who believed that about themselves would have an energy and a charisma you would want to get on board with.
You mentioned the sort of pleasure in identifying the kind of hellfire voice, but there's wonderful voice, wonderful cadence, wonderful vocabulary that the characters speak, and I wonder how you found this voice, what you were kind of looking to for that. King James Bible, presumably.
Yeah, I did a lot of, I had my old King James Bible that I had at university kind of face down on the table for literally months, kind of having to be brushed out of the way when we had dinner. So yeah, the King James Bible, also the accounts of the trials themselves.
Right.
Obviously. I mean, part of the reason I kind of interpolate those documents is because they were too good not to. The language, even just the average ostler or baker is using to talk about his experience is so astonishingly rich, so full of idiom, so descriptive. In a way that's almost quite surprising, but the only reason it's surprising is because we like to patronize people from history. It shouldn't be, really.
Do you think that's
But
because of a kind of an exclusion of sort of everyday people's voices?
I think partly, but also I think it's kind of a sort of liberal commitment to the idea that things are always getting better and never getting worse overall,
Mm.
which I disagree with. But we have to assume that people in the past were stupid and small-minded, and that we are clever and wide-minded, because otherwise we would have to ask serious questions about the way society is structured and is progressing. Yeah. So yeah, the Bible, and also the Discovery of Witches by Hopkins. So his writing is astonishing. Again, you kind of get a sense of him from that. Um, and the two things I came away with were, one, I didn't really want to go down like the porny Witchfinder General movie direction of painting him as like essentially a hornbag, because I don't think he was. But when you read The Discovery of Witches, it is really, really difficult not to read a sexual element into what was obviously an obsession for him. Even the terms in which he discusses witches, it's so visceral, it's so physical, it was like a sort of pseudo-sexual obsession for him, it feels like. Um,
Well, you
like,
have him at times quivering.
mm,
He's witnessed things, and he's quivering, and he's frantically longing to get and write down and write. There's this relationship to his own writing, which was kind of interesting in the, yeah.
yeah. Um, but that was also another thing. So kind of journals of contempt, from the mid 17th century, and there are quite a lot of them that are really, really good. Anna Trapnell, the female Puritan mystic, you can read her diaries. And so Puritans, they took diary making, they took recording their lives incredibly seriously, which is like wonderful for a historian of the period. They also took their dreams incredibly seriously. They were direct broadcasts from God as far as they were concerned a lot of the time, which was one of the reasons I wanted to have dream sequences as a big part of the book. Yeah.
There's multiple layers of storytelling, and I wrote to you last week. There's this relationship to authority, coincidence, and evidence. I was reading it, and in the first 15 pages, I was whimpering every time there would seem to be an omen, that might implicate somebody. But there's also gossip, and that gossip is often drunken and, circulates and transforms. And you call it in the book, or the narrator calls it in the book, grist for Manningtree's brute mill reputation. But Rebecca is extraordinarily smart, has an extraordinary wisdom for somebody who I think at the end of the book is merely kind of 21. There's also this evidential testimony of witnesses. There's this extraordinary part towards the end where Rebecca has this sort of narrative ability where she's able to improvise and to play authority in order to secure her freedom. And I just wondered how all of these different layers of storytelling and their relationship to authority, to coincidence, to evidence, informed an approach to narrative.
So I think kind of the first thing about that is, I think one of the things that has kind of engendered a simplification and a kind of cartoonification notion of witch trials throughout history. and something that means we take them less seriously is that I think if if you ask a lot of people why were the witch trials bad, the first thing they would say is because people can't be witches, fairly obviously. That, well, it was ridiculous. That the obvious innocence of the people who were accused. And so then I think a lot of people find it upsetting or confusing that actually confession played such a major part in witch trials, were much more common than most people would think. And yes, a lot of those confessions were obtained under duress, not torture, but effectively what we would now understand as torture, but what wasn't understood as torture then. And pressure, as was probably exerted on Rebecca West to obtain hers, and long imprisonment under really horrible conditions. But people confessed to this. Some people confessed before they were even imprisoned. And it felt important to me to make sure from the outset that there was a level of ambiguity to the narrative, in that it feels like a massive oversimplification to paint a witch trial as a case of the good, the innocent, the misunderstood on the edges of community versus the nefarious, the selfish on the inside. Were the accused women good women? In some ways, yes, but in other ways, no. It's never that simple. Were the people who were accusing them all bad? Not necessarily. And it felt like kind of offering those conflicting points of view, those overlapping and sometimes contradictory accounts, was kind of a way of gesturing to that ambiguity. Like, I didn't, apart from maybe Hopkins, I didn't want anyone to come away thinking, oh, well, X, he was a bad guy.
Right.
There aren't any heroines, but I feel kind of, other than, as I say, Hopkins, in some ways there aren't any absolute villains either. I felt like I enjoyed writing John Eads as well, because he felt like a way to get into, he's a fundamentally perhaps good man. And that's something we see earlier on. But once you get kind of twisted into these contortions of survivalism, I guess if there's a message to it at all, I wanted it to be that everyone is capable of extremely bad things. Forced to the brink by larger powers.
Could we have another reading?
Yes, you can.
And I would also just say, stream chat's open. Any of the live viewers, wherever you may be, stream chat's open for any comments, any questions, any observations you want to share.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't. Okay, I found a bit. I'm going to read an even shorter bit. That is the bit in the book that is probably the most like poetry. Yeah. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as See, she cannot, the witch cannot say it, the witch, the word of God sticks in her craw, the good word, why are her eyes like that? Unwholesome, like something baked in its own skin in the sun. Imagine licking a rotten, where they ripen and fall in secret, rotten in a mouth. Forgive us our trespasses as there must be signification. It is not difficult after all, a child knows it. My daughter, my 4-year-old, can count upon their hands, a rings of gold, click her fingers and turn the fleet to frothing blood. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy. And why singest thou psalms, my love, when thou knowest thyself to be a damned creature? And just like that, a handsome face, a jagged hoof set on the edge of the milk pail, it cannot be ignored, and neither would you. You would take it in your mouth. The truth is, he likes girls and women. Truly. They are steeped in story and also violets, a sweet life song. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come for ever and ever. And the truth is, it was different last night, seemed to want it more, spirited, avid, jagged. What was she thinking about? Damned if I know, never. Says she dreamed of walking through the white gardens of heaven when she came by a harp resting on an outcrop of cloud and pushed it, having within her a strange and sudden urge to destroy, to see it topple down through the sky like a morning star, which is, after all, the meaning of that name, the meaning of the name Lucifer.
Fantastic. There's a wonderful passage. There's a sense in which that really conveys this sense in which the actual and dreams and the imaginary mingle, which is something that you've already mentioned. I suppose because of this kind of mingling of the actual and dreams and the imaginary, there's a sense throughout of a kind of foregrounding of other senses rather than vision, or in addition to vision. And this is something that O'Connell notes in the Guardian, this extraordinarily vivid smellscape that's evoked throughout the book. And I wonder if you could just talk us through your thinking around the senses and how you think smell functions in the book in particular.
Okay, so I grew up in London, in Southeast London, where I still live. And maybe it's kind of a city thing, but I have a real love for what feel to me like real smells. Petrichor, manure, trees. Yeah, I think it's the way the senses function. I think perhaps it comes from kind of, I feel like one thing I've always been fascinated in is the idea that artificial smells added to food being pumped into shops is something that really kind of typifies contemporary existence.
Right.
So perhaps if we went back in time, one of the things that would kind of shock us most would be the absence of artificial smells.
Right.
Or perfumed things. That perhaps what feels kind of like the absence of smell to us around many things now is just kind of the conflicting information of artificialized smells. And before that technology existed, it must have been very different. And I mean, all the obvious stuff about how smell is the most evocative sense. I feel that very strongly. Like, it was just the other day, I was walking to Clapham with my flatmate, and someone walking a few steps ahead of us was wearing Diesel Fuel for Life, which was what my best friend used to wear in the first year of university.
Yeah.
And I forget all about Diesel Fuel for Life for years at a time. And then suddenly I get a whiff of Diesel Fuel for Life on a bus.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I am a 19-year-old again. In a really momentary flash. So that's something that really intrigues me.
You write about the congregation at St Mary's that it smells of bemingled emanations of rosewater perfume, womb clot, sweat and cinders. And at the opening of the book, Rebecca is looking at her mother and describing her in great detail, is taking her apart. And she writes, see how the smell and look of her leads me to other things, other places, which I suppose is the diesel on the bus, right? or else my understanding of
the diesel fuel for life. Yeah.
or else my understanding of other things and other places does through the smell and look of her, and that is what it is to have a mother.
Mm.
We do have a question in the chat. Emma Zado is asking, did you find any folklore in East Anglia that inspired or influenced your writing of the Manningtree witches?
Specific folklore that was kind of regional folklore, not so much. So, obviously, Keith Thomas, you mentioned in your introduction, was also kind of a seminal text I was working with as I was going along, in terms of kind of animal symbolism was obviously something I was thinking about a lot. The significance of the hare or the rabbit was something I was really attracted to. So the story about Boudica and the hare, the battle she was killed in, she saw a little hare run out into the field of engagement and then followed it in her chariot and then died. The idea of hares as bad omens, I guess that might be specifically East Anglia. So one of my favorite Manningtree memories is I think it must have been like, I don't know, like the third time I visited my dad there or something. My dad moved there after I went to university, sold our council flat in London and got a little place in Manningtree. And it must have been like the third time I was there or something. I got off the train and there was just this field full of dead rabbits.
Right.
Like literally 30 or 40 of them it must have been. And God knows what had killed them. They looked into, so it must have been something on the grass, maybe like a pesticide of some kind they had eaten.
Mm-hmm.
But it was just very, and then my dad was like, oh yeah. It's been like that for a couple of days. It was really like one night I was walking back from the pub and I looked over and I thought, oh, isn't that lovely? All those little rabbits in the field just
right.
And then the day after I came back again and they were all just dead.
You do still see in fields around Norfolk dead crows strung up as I presume to ward off other birds and crows. You do see them still, sort of rotting corpses, petrified corpses.
Not cool, horrible, a bit cool. So no, not so much. But I did discover lots of things I would like to draw into things later.
Right.
I was really interested in the Green Children of Wolf Pit, which is near Bury St Edmunds. It's much earlier legend. Two little children who appeared in the 13th century in a wolf pit on the edge of an Essex village and had green skin. And spoke a strange tongue that was unknown to everyone, and would eat only broad beans. And that's a really fascinating story, which maybe, fingers crossed, very much down the line from now, there's a novel in. But not right now.
Speaking of writing novels, you're known as a poet, and this is your debut novel. Could you talk to us a bit about your process of writing and what you think the affordances of each might be?
Yeah.
Please.
I guess the first thing to say would be, so I work full time as well as writing, and one of the reasons I guess poetry was what I did was because poetry is much easier to fit into kind of the gaps of your life. wherever they may be. You know, you can write a poem on the bus. You can write a poem going from your job back home. And I think one of the things I love about poetry and the poetry scene is that I think because of that, partly because of that, poetry is a lot less homogenous culturally, particularly in terms of class. And I think, you know, I know people do become novelists while also writing full time, and there are ways to make it work, but it is not easy. And so while writing poetry was something I could do and fit around my normal life without having to make particularly serious changes to it. And, you know, maybe write enough things that were decent to get a collection together every 5 years. Writing a novel certainly isn't, you know, it had to be early mornings and late nights. In a way that I hadn't really done before. And I think kind of the material conditions in which the work is produced are often overlooked and shouldn't be. So, I mean, I'd always wanted to write a novel, but like honestly can say the biggest barrier to me doing so was the fact I need to work. And one of the reasons I was able to write the novel was because I got a work in progress grant from the Society of Authors, and because I happened to work for a company who were good enough to let me take a month's unpaid leave so I could finish the manuscript. Unpaid, but they let me take it, which not all companies would. So I think it's something I wish writers spoke about more.
Right.
So I kind of wanted to say that first. And secondly, I found it very hard to let go of my perfectionism when it comes to poetry, because my work is very compressed and fragmentary, and kind of perhaps what's the opposite of belies? I don't know. Anyway, perhaps it doesn't necessarily, the work that went into it, despite its brevity, wasn't always obvious. But
right,
no, I would work for many weeks over 6 lines,
like a piece of some stitched lace.
Yes.
Concealed labor.
Lace. That's a really good metaphor for it. Yes. And I would work on getting it perfect, and that's something you can't really do with a novel. Well, I mean, you can, but it won't be published within your lifetime. Hello, Proust. So there was a certain degree of letting go, of realizing that at some point you're just going to have to say, she put down the spade, and there's no way you can make that beautiful or ornate. And if you try, you'll just drive yourself mad. And being okay with that. And I think the fact I was writing historical fiction really helped with that, actually, because I had a beginning and a middle and an end already. And it was a question of adding flesh to the bones. But I had kind of a destination up there already to be aiming at. And I think that was really helpful to me in terms of letting go of my instincts to second guess everything and to reassess everything constantly. Yeah.
It's maybe this is my last question. So unless anybody jumps in on the stream chat, but it's quite a sort of banal question about the practice of writing as well. You note in the back of the book that you finished the manuscript off during the pandemic. And I wonder if you could reflect on what that experience has been like for you, of completing and then launching, you know, your first novel at this time.
So it's a weird one, because you have all the excitement of like getting a book deal and stuff, and then obviously the lead times are so long in publishing that there's just this massive space where nothing happens.
Right.
And then, God, I remember, so when I first got the book deal and stuff, it was like, oh, everything will be fine by March, surely. Was kind of the idea, which obviously it's not. It's been a bit weird not being able to have those things that are usually kind of the little celebratory markers of what a writer who has a new book out does, like seeing your book in shop windows and going into Waterstones and being like, look at me, and
Yes.
all of that. Obviously I haven't been able to do, but it's still been really absolutely lovely. And I feel like I've met lots of new people and have been really quite astonished by people liking it in the way they do, in a way that is really salutary and nice, and I will carry with me for a long time. That's another weird thing about going from poetry to novels. Like, I know people liked Fondue and liked Humbert Summer, but you don't really get much feedback. Like, it's niche. It's a niche art.
Right.
Unless you're doing a certain kind of thing.
You're public property now.
Yeah, which is weird. But it's been a really lovely experience, of which this is part. Yeah, but strange. Just on a basic level, you can't help but feel like, oh, well, what if? Because obviously, and it's stupid. It's really, really stupid. But so much of the way the book industry, it's focused on debuts.
Right.
You get a chance to make a splash with your debut, and in a way you don't get to later, which is dumb and shouldn't be the case, because books should be judged on their own terms. But you only get one debut, and you want it to go as good, as well as possible. And so you can't help but do that kind of, oh well, what if my book had been coming out 2 months later, or oh, but what if? But I'm in a good position, because by this point all the bookshops and stuff, they know how to use Zoom. Like, if my book had been coming out March last year, I would have had to so
Okay. Well, look, thank you. There's comments in the stream chat. You've got people from all over the place. Glasgow crew in the house, Suffolk crew, Derby crew, Margate crew, Kent Coast crew, North Norfolk. Yes, Emma's saying, I love this book. Thank you. Oh, but did also ask for no spoilers. So hopefully we haven't.
Sorry, most of them die.
Yes. Emma Caddy, beg your pardon, Edward Caddy said, thank you very much
That's
for the
my
conversation.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, yes, just off screen. Okay, well, look, thank you so much, A.K. Blakemore, for joining us this evening. As I said, it's a great privilege. And I'd like to also just thank those at home, wherever you might be, logged in, streaming. Thank you for joining us. And also thank you to the Assembly House Trust for hosting tonight's event. As I said earlier, the book's on sale. Seek it out and purchase a copy. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for hosting.
Okay. Hello. Sorry, I realised I was muted for a second there for the stream, though I wasn't muted for the others. Thank you both for that discussion and readings. It was really nice to hear you both talk openly and relaxed, and I felt like I was at the book launch, the debut book launch. I look forward to hearing about the book coming out, about the Broadbean children. I was going to post a link to buy the book, but I don't know which website to use. If you have a preference, then do post one in the chat, Amy, and I'll post it onto YouTube, or Jonathan, if you because I think that'd be good to do. Bookshop.org. Bookshop.org. So yeah, that's in the chat. So upcoming on Assembly Online, we have, because this event was delayed, sorry, just doing two things at once. Here's a link in the chat. Because this one was delayed by a week, we have an Assembly Online next week, which is unusual, 2 weeks in a row, you lucky lot. We have Veronica Secules joining us from Groundwork Gallery for the Japan Water exhibition opening, which will be really exciting, as we've got all the artists who've agreed to join us on Zoom for a discussion. So that would be good. And then 2 weeks after, we have Sarah Lowndes for an event on what community means now. Yes, Fiona's just said Book Hive Norwich. Yes, definitely in Norwich, do support your local bookshops. And thank you to everyone also who submitted for the Summer Open. I think some of the people watching tonight probably did. We received over 800 submissions, and we'll be selecting the show over the next week, so we'll be in touch soon. Thank you to everyone who tuned in tonight. I can see a lot of familiar names in the chat, and look forward to seeing you soon. Oh, okay. Take care and good night.